Hey everybody, welcome back into the studio. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm working on my piece for the Masterpieces in Miniature show this year, and it's a very small one. It's just a little 8x6 of a common loon. So I thought this would be a good change up from what we usually do. We don't usually show you how to do very small things and how to refine yourself a little bit more to make a better, stronger miniature piece. So why don't we get into the studio today and I'll show you how to do all those little tricks to make a wonderful little miniature. And as always, don't forget to like it, share it, and subscribe to me. Hit the little bell. You'll know whenever the new videos come out. Let's get in there and paint. All right, so we're going to do this little one, and as I said in the intro, this is a piece I'm doing for the Masterpieces in Miniature, and even though it's only 8x6, the show really likes the extreme detail in the small miniatures. I guess that's the whole premise of the show is let's see what you can do in a very small area. So like any other original, I'm just going to start by blocking in and putting in my local or my base colors, and I'll block in just the major color changes on the board before I start doing the loon. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm not concerned too much with streaking. Now, I am putting it in several layers. Now, I believe if memory serves, I did about 4 thin layers and just blended them in so that they had a soft little blend. And that's what I'm yakking about right here, is how it's a nice soft blend, but it still has a lot of streakiness, and not to worry about the streakiness. And that's a key point because we're going to be doing all this streaky water after. So putting on several layers, trying to get your board completely gradated without any kind of streaking whatsoever is going to be a waste of time and a buildup of unnecessary paint on your board. So for this exercise, try to put in a couple of thin coats that gets rid of the white of the board, gets you to basically your local colors. And what you want to see in this piece is a nice blue-green down at the bottom that transfers up to a yellowy green if we're going up the left hand side, and then on the right hand side it's going to transfer up to even warmer kind of a whitey yellow, and that is going to represent some haze, okay, which we'll do later on in the piece. So like anything else, I'm blocking in the head right now, doing my simple process of looking at my reference and figuring out where the big color changes are. So when the first layer goes on, like right here, I'm more concerned with, is this the area where the color changes? Is this the area where it's going to be green? Is this the area where it's going to be purple? Is this the area where it's going to be like that kind of iridescent blue? And that's the key to blocking in, is making sure that your proportioning is right. This is the stage to do all your heavy proportion. Even if it's incorrect, it's very easy to correct at this stage because you haven't built up the paint, you haven't put in any detail, so you haven't really wasted any time. So now's the time to make sure everything is proportioned and everything is placed right and everything is sized well. Sizing is another real key to doing a very good underpainting or blocking in your basic elements, because what I mean is, if I'm laying down right now I'm doing the greens, is that area the correct size and the correct proportion of green that's in my reference? Where does it stop being green and start being purple? And that's what I mean by sizing. I'm hoping everybody's understanding what I mean about sizing. If I were to make that highlight on the head, the green that I just painted, much too large, it would make the head roll in incorrect space, and it might make it look like it's off whack, make the loon look a little deformed. So that's what I mean about sizing. You not only want the correct color, the correct local color, the correct blocking in, but you want the correct sizing or proportioning too when you do this, okay? Now, another thing that I wanted to point out is you'll see here that I have completely ignored any of the white markings on his head. Why? Well, it's going to be a lot easier to build up the shape and form in the darks of the head and then apply the whites over top. Now, I know some of you are probably saying, oh, in earlier videos, you've always said that it's easier to put your darks over your lights. That is absolutely correct. But when you're talking about a very small area, it's very easy to get the whites, or the lights, if you will, doesn't even have to be white, just any kind of lights, over top of darks is not as cumbersome as doing a large area, and it doesn't muddy like a large area would, okay? So in this case, for me to be able to detail the head in the blacks, I can do all this fancy brushwork here, because a lot of this that I'm doing right now is dry brushing. It's and wet on wet, blending one color into another. Now, if I had the whites there, I'd have to work around the whites, and that would be very cumbersome. It would probably look very messy. It wouldn't have nice clean edges. Whereas if I do all my blacks and then I paint the whites on top, which is going to come up pretty soon, you'll see that you get a nice crisp edge and you get a nice clean shape, and you don't have the hassle of trying to work around very small, minute little shapes, especially the dots in the neck. They're so small that working around them, they'd end up getting painted over. The edges would get painted over, and they'd be probably painted to the point where you couldn't see them anyways. So just wait. I like, especially when I'm doing a dark on light animal, I like to build up my darks right here. Same thing as I do the body. I'm building up the shape, the roll of the loon first, and then I'll worry about all the thousands of little white markings that are on top of them. So right now I'll build up the shape and the form. I'll run my darks into my purples, into a little bit of an iridescent green, so we get the turning of the body, and then I'll go in and I'll do my whites. So talk about perfect timing. Now I'm starting my whites here. So if you hold off and you have some patience and you just concentrate on doing the darks, then you can start applying your whites here. So first I start with a brighter white, and then I mix it down. And what I mean by mix down is I make the color of the white a little more muddied and blued and grayed as it turns around the neck to get our shape and form. So you can see now that I'm starting to lay in these little tiny white spots. I would have had a nightmare if I tried to paint around all those little streaks in his breast and all those streaks in his neck, the main markings. The loon is known for the back markings and those neck markings. It would have been a nightmare trying to paint around those if I tried to paint in the whites at the time of blocking in. So ignore minute, this long-winded explanation comes down to this. Ignore minute little details until the end. Add them in the end. Concentrate on your shape and form. Broken record, I know, every video is the same, and that's because that's the process that a professional artist works, whether it's detailed, whether it's very loose, impressionistic. We all build up our shape and form and then add any detail that we're going to add. So now that I have a nice base color laid down, a nice flow from blacks to greens to purples on the back sides of the loon here, I can start breaking it up. So I can take but a little darker color, and start breaking up, creating some tail feathers, secondary and primary feathers, a little bit of down on the side. And you want to keep the breakup when you're doing those small black lines that I just did. You want to keep those not as deep or as dark as right here. Right here, it's a lot darker, a lot more black into the color, and that tells the viewer that there's a deeper crack there, whereas these lines on the back of the wings, they're not as deep a value change, so they tell the viewer these are just subtle little cracks in the wind, but everything in the wing, but they're all on the same plane. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're doing these. So another thing I wanted to point out while I'm painting in these detailed markings on the back is when you're putting in the markings, so your circles, your squares, any geometric shape for that matter, make sure that you're following the perspective of the loon. So right now is a good example of how I'm angling my down from left to right, because this is actually coming up the side of the bird and then rolling to the top. So when I lay down my top sides of the down that I'm painting here, they get lighter. See, now I'm applying a lighter color. That's so that you get the feel of this is down on the side of the bird, but it's rolling and it's turning with the actual planes of the animal, because at the side here they have that little roll between their breast down that rolls on the edge and then goes up into the top primary and secondary feathers that sit on top of that. So you want to make sure that when you're painting any kind of shape, that shape follows the perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's a good example. If I have a circle that's just right in front of us, two planes, it's circular. But if we were to put that circle on the side of a cube, we have to change its appearance to suit or apply to the plane that it's sitting on. So I have to manipulate that circle to make it look like it's sitting on the plane, and that's by changing its shape and changing its perspective. So keep that in mind whenever you're putting in these little tiny shapes. So as we start to paint the reflection in the water, I want to plant a couple little seeds in your brain, things for you to remember when you're doing water and when you're doing reflections. So there's two major things about doing reflections. One, you always want a kind of broken up curved line, unless the lake is in one of those completely still and placid looks. You're going to have a jagged reflected image. Here the water's kind of a semi-movement, so it's got a bit of a jag. So when you watch me paint this reflection, you'll see that there's not a single straight line. The only straight lines I'll put in is when I'm breaking it up after, and those are straight-ish, but they still have a little bit of stop and start to them. So you can see even these reflections here, there's a jag to them. Okay, there's nothing that's crystal clear and in focus. All right. Second, you always want to downtone or mute your colors. I like to mute my colors with whatever the color is I'm painting on top of, and that brings it closer to that color and value. And I also want to downtone my values. Yes, this loon is high contrast black and white, but the values, or the distance in contrast between my darks and my lights and my shadow, are a lot less than in my subject matter, keeping my attention on my subject matter. So why don't we paint up these reflections and the water and a little music while we do it. So now as I start to break up the water and I'm starting to detail it, there's something I really want to point out, and that's that water flows into each other. So all your lines have to have a relationship to each other and a flow into each other. It doesn't mean that one line becomes another line, but I always want to make sure that if one line is flowing down and into the right and then travels into a darker color, then the next darker color, it starts with a down into the right flow and continues on from there. And that's how you get a really nice breakup and flow to water. Water is something that's continuously moving, and the second you take that photograph, if you were to take a camera, put it on high speed, shutter speed, or on repetitive shot speed, so you take like 3 shots inside of a second, you would see that all 3 shots are actually quite different, especially in the detailing, because water is constantly moving and changing and evolving. So to emphasize that flow, all your lines have to have a relationship to each other. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure that they share a common flow pattern on the ends that they meet. So if a light and a dark are meeting, they have to have a common direction and flow to them. And then once they transfer into that new color, you can do whatever you want, break it up. But wherever a light and a dark are meeting, they have to flow into each other, okay? Having sharp, jagged edges, that's when you start telling people, hey, this is a splash, or this is a wave, or this is a something that's not flowing but actually crashing into each other when it comes to water, okay? So try to paint all your strokes with a nice flow from one stroke, or one color, if you will, into another. So as we finish up here, I thought I'd go over a couple of things. One, it is much, much easier to deal with your large areas of darker color first, and then lay in your highlights over her top, in this case, the white strokes. Now, what I mean by that is, if you have a, let's say you're doing a leopard, that is predominantly more the oranges, the rusty colors, the earthy browns, I'd paint all the earthy browns first and then put the black dots on top, the little small black dots on top. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that you do the large areas of color first and then you lay the smaller details on top. But don't try to lay down those tiny little dots, like in this case, the spots in his feathers, in his neck, and then try to paint around them. You'll just create sharp edges, a lot of buildup of paint around your edges. You'll do a lot of overpainting. You'll have to do a lot of cleanup, and you won't have that clean look. Whereas if you just, like we did in this painting, paint the darker areas in, did all my nice blending, especially in the head. This was very, very, very important in the head, where I did a lot of blending from one color to the next. And then I laid my whites or my small details on top, and I got a nice clean look. I would not have got that clean look if I tried to do it as a workaround where I laid the whites down and tried to paint around them. Okay, do remember, whenever you're doing reflections, you want nice jagged or squiggly lines. You don't want very straight lines. Even when I broke it up, yes, I used the ruler to do those streakings come off the back, but they have little jaunts and jabs into them. And you also want to keep your contrasting down when you're doing a reflection. If you have your contrasting too high, you'll draw way too much attention to your shadow, and then that will draw attention away from your subject matter. And you want to be very, very aware of that, especially when you're doing a small thumbnail miniature like this one that's only 8 inches by 6 inches, where the main subject matter is the loon. That's the emphasis of the painting. You want to keep the viewer's interest on the loon, and everything around it is the supporting cast. So when you're doing a painting, it's very smart to start thinking about your painting before you even paint it. Is this a loon painting with water supporting around it, or is it a landscape painting with a loon just as a supporting element in it? This one obviously was a loon painting, and the water and the reeds were supporting casts, so they were downtoned or painted with less attention to them, so that the loon itself kept the focal point and is the focal point. And I didn't have things competing with the loon. In fact, the only reason why I put these reeds in was 2 reasons. 1, create a little bit of depth, and 2, to break up everything in this painting before the reeds was horizontal. So we had a horizontal flow that just flowed from right to left, and it flowed right off the page and nothing brought it back in. By putting these just couple simple reeds in, it did a second thing for me. It broke up those horizontals and gave me some verticals, and it also gave me a vertical line that the flow of the loon flows off to the left hand side and out. These reeds help to bring the viewer's eye back down and back up into the loon. Okay, so those are a couple of things that I thought you should be thinking about when you do the painting. So there's the final piece. I think it turned out really good. We'll get this framed up. We'll shoot it on off to the Masterpieces in Miniature Out West show for the 2021 show. And that'll wrap up this edition. So until next time, everybody, as usual, be good to each other, stay safe, and happy painting.